Welcome to the Adams County Historical Society. Tonight's program takes a very unusual look at history, the history of Christmas in the United States, focusing on the vast changes that came from the beginnings of the country, where it was not a well-known holiday, to the Civil War, where it was used as propaganda by both sides. Our speaker is Brad Stone, a retired federal executive who specialized in medicine and public health services, and who today works as a docent at the National Civil War Medicine Museum in Frederick, as well as a naval surgeon reenactor at the USS Constellation in Baltimore Harbor. Brad has made a study of the Christmas customs and how they were used and how they evolved to the very upbeat, pleasant, and happy symbols they are today. So I'm going to turn the program over by introducing you to Brad Stone, who came dressed for the part of the Civil War version of Santa Claus. So Brad, as an introduction to your program, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the uniform that you are wearing, which, as I understand it, was authentic to the Civil War and is totally different from what we expect today. Could you explain your outfit?
Yes, this is modeled on the illustration that Thomas Nast did in 1863. And he developed this costume for Santa Claus as a way of showing that Santa and Christmas in general was solidly in support of the Union cause. So basically what he did is he wrapped Santa in the Union flag. The top part of my costume represents the blue field of the flag. It has 34 stars representing each state in the Union. And of course, my red and white pants represent the stripes of that flag. Now, Nast would go on after the war, develop the suit that we now associate with Santa Claus. Basically the same suit, but it's all red. It has the same trim. So Nast, during the Civil War, begins the process of creating the modern American Santa that we all know and love today.
Thank you so much. And now let's dip back into your work as a historian of the Christmas customs.
To begin with, I think it's helpful to look back at the history of the Christmas holiday in America. I think, like many people, I had this misconception that Christmas came to us from our Pilgrim forefathers and that they just carried on their traditions. Well, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. If we go back to our Puritan or Pilgrim forefathers, they really shunned the Christmas holiday. They thought it was associated with the Church of England or Catholicism, neither of which they particularly liked, and they discouraged the celebration of Christmas to the point that in places like Boston for decades, it was illegal to celebrate the holiday, and if you were caught doing it, you could be subject to some very severe fines. Now, other colonies in America took a different view of the holiday, and they celebrated it, but not in kind of the reverent religious way we do today. In places like Georgetown, it was time for frivolity, and indeed, Captain John Smith in his diaries recorded that he would celebrate the holiday with a lot of eggnog. So he was full of the spirit, but not necessarily religious spirit. Now, going forward to revolutionary times of the Revolutionary War, attitudes towards Christmas differed among the colonies. Many in the North did not celebrate the holiday. They associated with England, which of course they were not particularly fond of at the time of the Revolutionary War. Others did celebrate the holiday, like George Washington, but again, not in a religious way. One of the interesting things about George Washington is on one Christmas, he hired a camel to appear at Mount Vernon. Again, not for religious reasons. He wasn't thinking of the manger. He just liked camels. And you can kind of gauge Washington's attitude towards Christmas by the fact that he chose Christmas Day as the day to launch one of his most decisive attacks of the Revolutionary War, his attack on the Hessian barracks in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, the Hessians, who were German mercenaries fighting for the British, did observe the Christmas holiday. They decorated their barracks with evergreens. They were the first people in the United States, or what would become the United States, to have Christmas trees. So they did observe the holiday, but contrary to popular belief, they weren't engaged in a lot of drinking. They weren't caught off guard because they were drunk. They were caught off guard because it was the dead of winter. They were bone tired, and also it was the Christmas holiday. So when Washington attacked, he was able to win a decisive victory. Now, if you go and look at America at the turn of the 18th and early 19th century, you'll see that a lot of Americans are somewhat dubious about the Christmas holiday, and they have some good reason to be. Because if you look at how Christmas was celebrated in much of Europe, including in England, there are some rather scary aspects to it. One of the big ways of celebrating the holiday in Europe and England was through the custom called mummering. Now, when we think of mummers today, we think of those rather jolly guys that parade in Philadelphia. But in Europe and in England at the time, mummering had a whole different aspect to it. It really consisted of people, usually from the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum, coming to people's homes and entertaining them by song or dance, and not necessarily in a way that these homeowners want to be entertained, and then expecting in return things like money or food or very often alcohol. So there was almost a feeling of very scary Halloween going on in this process. And you can see this in some of the songs that we sing today at Christmas time that seem very wholesome on the surface, but when you look at the lyrics, they're kind of disturbing. One of them is "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Well, if you look at the lyrics, what do they say? They have, "We all like some figgy pudding. We all like some figgy pudding. So bring it right here. We won't go until we get some. So bring it out some here." Now, again, to me, that sounds more like an extortion threat than a holiday greeting. And mummering could be very severe. Indeed, in Newfoundland, around the time of the Civil War, mummering was outlawed because people had been murdered in their homes by these gangs of mummers. So it's somewhat understandable that in this period, a lot of Americans had big reservations about celebrating Christmas. Now, with the start of the 19th century, that starts to change for two main reasons. One is the Second Great Awakening. This is a religious revivalist movement that sweeps America, particularly in the northern part of the country, and really infuses to every major aspect of everyday life, including the holidays. Suddenly, holidays like Christmas are given a much more reverential perspective. Now, the other major force that's guiding an appreciation of the Christmas holiday is the Industrial Revolution, which is really taking off in parts of Europe, certainly England, and in the United States, particularly in the northern states. And this Industrial Revolution is changing society in another number of ways. First of all, it's making goods far more plentiful and far more affordable. And one of the ways that you can manifest your goodwill during the Christmas holidays is by exchanging gifts. The Industrial Revolution is making more of those gifts available, more affordable, and allowing people from all walks of life to engage in this kind of practice during the Christmas holiday. Now, this enthusiasm for Christmas starts to also manifest itself in the culture and literature of the early 18th century. One of the first examples is in 1819, when Washington Irving, one of the great writers of the time, writes a series of essays called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, a Gentleman, which outlines how Christmas should be celebrated in a proper American home. In 1822, another major milestone comes with Reverend Clement Clark Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, which most of us know as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. This really helps to establish a lot of the basic foundations of the modern American Christmas. It establishes kind of the spirit of what the holiday should be about, gift giving, something that's focused on the family and particularly children. And it also talks about a lot of key elements of Santa Claus, what the American Santa Claus will be about. He will be a jolly guy. He will be a guy focused on rewarding children, not punishing them. He also brings in the key aspect of Santa Claus, which are his reindeer. That's how he transports himself. Now, in 1843, another major literary figure weighs in on Christmas, and that's Charles Dickens. He writes A Christmas Carol. Once again, a lot of the major elements of Christmas are added in. The book is published in Victorian England, and that's enormously important because at that time, what goes on in Victorian England in terms of fads or traditions get readily adopted in the United States. Victorian England at the time really sets the model for what American society is going to do. His book also focuses in on the importance of Christmas in terms of family, in terms of generosity, and in terms of Christian spirit. So, again, going into the middle part of the 19th century, a lot of the foundations of the Christmas holiday are beginning to be set. With Americans becoming more and more interested in celebrating the holiday, they have to kind of figure out what holiday traditions they want to draw upon from Europe. And there are a number of them to look towards. One of the questions is, when do you want to celebrate the holiday? That ranges from places like Holland and Belgium that celebrate it in the early part of December to places in more eastern sections of Europe that celebrate it in early January. Most, however, though, celebrate around the time that, we do. But then there's the question of what is the figure of Christmas that you want to gravitate towards. There are a number in many countries. If you go to England, there's Father Christmas. If you go to France, there's Père Noël. In Holland and Belgium, there's Santa Claus. And in Germany, there's St. Nicholas. They have some commonalities. They all have very distinctive beards, but they have some pretty profound differences. For example, Santa Claus and St. Nicholas have companions. In St. Nicholas, the German version of Santa Claus, he has Krampus, and Santa Claus in Holland has Wat Piet. And these associates punish bad children in very severe ways. So do you want to carry on those traditions? Father Christmas, on the other hand, in England, is more concerned with sort of adult celebrations of Christmas. So which tradition are you going to draw upon? So America, in looking at all these traditions, doesn't really draw upon England or Scotland or Ireland nor France. What they really gravitate toward is Germany. So we go back to the Hessians that we talked about before. They may have lost the battle, but in some ways they won the War of Christmas. And that's for two main reasons, one internal and one external. So let's begin with the external, and that focuses in on this gentleman. He's Prince Albert of Coburg, Germany. He becomes kind of the Martha Stewart of Christmas, and as she would say, that's kind of a good thing. Now, why is he so influential? Well, he becomes the husband of Queen Victoria. He will introduce a lot of the native customs from his section of Germany into her court during the Christmas season. One of the main things he introduces is the Christmas tree, and beyond that, decorating a Christmas tree with special ornaments. He also puts an emphasis on providing gifts to members of the family, particularly children, and wrapping those gifts in special wrapping paper. Now, when he introduces these customs, they get picked up very quickly by the leading publications in England, and they publish illustrations of what Queen Victoria's court looks like during the Christmas holidays, and almost immediately, proper British families all want to have Christmas trees and ornaments. Very short time thereafter, a lot of these illustrations start making their way into the United States. Every proper American family also wants to have a Christmas tree and ornaments. Now, speaking of those ornaments, at around the same time that Christmas ornaments are becoming very, very popular in the United States and in England, Germany develops one of the great Christmas ornament industries of the world. It's so influential that the Germans will continue to provide the vast majority of Christmas ornaments to the United States all the way up to the eve of the Second World War. Now, the other part of the German influence comes from what I call the stealth immigration, and that is an enormous influx of Germans in the 2 decades leading into the Civil War. I think many Americans know that there was an enormous influx of Irish immigrants during that period. It's about, I think, 1.6 million immigrants. But the German immigration was almost as large. It's about 1.4 million Germans. And in some ways, their immigration was more influential because the Germans tended to be a little better educated and more skilled. And the other thing that boosted the effect of their immigration is there was already a large established German-American population at that time in the United States. And with these immigrants, they brought a lot of their traditions in terms of celebrating Christmas. Again, they put a real emphasis on exchanging gifts and particularly giving gifts to children. A lot of this came from the influence of Martin Luther, who believed that providing gifts to children was a real way of honoring the birth of Jesus. Now, these customs were readily assimilated into American culture. And going into the last few decades of the Civil War, things really accelerate in America in terms of adopting the type of Christmas that seems more familiar to us today. Christmas becomes more commercialized in England and in America. You start to see the widespread use of things like Christmas cards and Christmas-related novelties in marketplaces. Christmas becomes a bigger and bigger part of the publishing industry, both in terms of literature and also in terms of advertising in newspapers. So increasingly, Christmas is seen as a very important holiday and particularly an important way of celebrating families and children. And indeed, by the eve of the Civil War, most states in the United States have adopted Christmas as a state holiday. In 1861, the year that the Civil War starts, 29 out of the 34 states have made Christmas a legal holiday. It's one of the few things at that point in American history the Americans can agree upon because increasingly the country is becoming more and more divided. Now, can the love of Christmas keep the country united? Well, sadly, the answer is no, because it really can't address the major issue dividing the nation, and that is slavery. For the 4 million enslaved Americans, Christmas is a whole other reality. If you look at Southern newspapers at the eve of the Civil War, you'll see some things that look rather perverse. On the one hand, you see items for Christmas for sale being advertised, things like toys, but they're next to advertisements for things like the sale of enslaved people, including women and children. And this time of year for enslaved people is one of the worst times of the year. Many of these people are on lease, put on lease by their owners for work at other farms or plantations. And these leases run out at the end of the year. So that's the time of year where many of these enslaved families may be broken up to be leased to other farms or plantations, and the family is separated. Likewise, this time of year is when the tax season ends. So if you are someone who owns enslaved people and you own taxes, you may sell your property, including your enslaved people, to other farms or plantations to be able to pay the tax man. So once again, it's a prime time for enslaved families to be torn apart. Now, some slaveholders brag about the fact that during the Christmas holidays, they provide their slaves with more food or give them less work to do. One of the more notorious people that talk about this is South Carolina Senator James Hammond, who brags about how well he treats his slaves during the Christmas season. But James Hammond is renowned for his savagery towards his enslaved workers. He's known to savagely beat them, sexually assault them. So as many people like Frederick Douglass observed, these gestures that occur during Christmas really don't amount to anything. They are attempt to cover up what enslavement really means for all these individuals and families. And Christmas in many ways is the worst time of the year. So, of course, because the issue of slavery cannot be solved, the nation goes to war. And almost immediately begins sort of a competition by both the Union and the Confederacy as to who can weaponize Christmas. And the reason for this is that, as Lincoln said, both sides believe that God is on their side. So by extension, Christmas and Santa Claus must also be on their side. So you see in pro-secessionist newspapers like the Atlanta Chronicle, these declarations that the Confederacy is in fact a confederacy of Christmas states. Whereas in pro-union publications like the Philadelphia Inquirer, they claim that Christmas is a good old Yankee custom and that the Confederacy is, acting like Scrooge. Well, in this battle for Christmas, the Union has an enormous advantage. This person, Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is one of the great illustrators of the time and one of the most influential. He works for certainly the most influential publication in America, Harper's Weekly. He is a superb sketch artist and illustrator. He is a German-American immigrant, which means that he is going to bring a lot of that perspective into his view on what the American Christmas should be all about. And he is going to be the primary architect for the modern American Christmas. Now, a few more things about him. He is staunchly pro-abolition. He abhors slavery. He is very staunchly pro-union. He's also full of hate for the Confederacy. Well, he is a staunch Republican, and he is a very strong admirer of Abraham Lincoln. His first depiction of Santa Claus in the Civil War is regarded by many as really the first American depiction of Santa Claus. And you see it in this illustration, which he did for Harper's Weekly. And I always love how they modestly titled themselves. They call themselves the Journal of Civilization. And you see it here in this illustration. Santa is sitting atop his sleigh with the reindeer in the background. And in this illustration, Nast is literally pulling out all the stops to show you that Santa and the holiday celebration is solidly pro-union. So first of all, up at the top of the picture, you see a U and the S standing for United States. Then with Santa, you see that Nast is literally wrapping him in the Union flag. The top coat that Santa is wearing has 34 stars representing the 34 states of the Union, and his red and white pants represent the stripes of the American flag or the Union flag. Now, Santa is surrounded by a lot of Union soldiers who are well-dressed and have a lot of packages. They're getting them from Santa because they are good men. They are fighting for the right side. Up above Santa, of course, you see the enormous Union flag. And if you didn't get the point on which side Santa and Christmas are on, Nast makes it abundantly clear by the toy that Santa is entertaining the soldiers with. It's kind of hard to see in this illustration, but the toy is Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, hanging from a noose. Now, I think you'll agree with me, they don't make toys like they used to. Now, if you're thinking, gee, Brad, maybe you're reading too much into it, no, I'm going to show you the first cartoon, Christmas cartoon, that Nast did in the Civil War. That's from the previous year, and here it is. It's an enormous Christmas tree, and it has an American flag, or a Union flag, hanging or flying from the top of it. And you'll notice that people are merrily dancing around it. But if you look carefully at the tree, the ornaments mainly consist of leading Confederate figures hanging from the tree. So, as you can see, Nast was very adamant about the fact that Santa and Christmas were a Union holiday and were to be used as a weapon against the South. Now, something else that Nast felt very strongly about is the importance of Christmas as a family holiday, and there was a time that families should be together. And he understood that for the first time in American history, millions of American men have been separated from their families, and that Christmas was kind of a time to highlight this separation and the toll it was taking on America's families. The war had brought a lot of destruction, millions of lives have been shattered by death and dismemberment, and separation itself was taking its toll on American families. So here in this illustration, he's showing a woman at her window, thinking of the man, her husband, at the battlefront. Behind her are two children tucked in bed. And in the other panel, you see the man, the soldier at the battlefront, thinking of the family he left behind. It's a very poignant illustration. But Nast also, as a reminder that Christmas is to be celebrated, in the upper left-hand corner, you see that Santa is still working to provide presents to the children and other members of the family. He's up on the roof with the reindeer. So he's sending the message that Christmas is a time for family, it's a spiritual time, but it's also a time that should be celebrated materially as well. Now, the Civil War is a time when Christmas is also sort of highlighting the impact that the war is having on the North and the South and the disparity between the two. For the North, the war brings a lot of destruction in terms of the lives lost and the men who have been wounded. But in terms of the economy, the North is flourishing. The North starts the war. The Union has a far bigger economy. It's a far more industrialized economy. And as the war goes on, that economy is doing better and better. There's more and more prosperity in the Union, and that's reflected in how the Christmas holiday is celebrated both at home and on the battlefield. At home, there's more affluence, more gifts can be given, more food to eat. And likewise on the battlefield, the men at the battlefront are given larger and larger rations. They're given delicacies like oysters to eat during the holidays. They're getting more packages from home. So again, Christmas is highlighting for the Union, in many ways, how much better things are getting. It's a far different message for the South. For them, Christmas is driving home the devastation that's occurring throughout their region. A number of factors play into this. One is the fact that much of the Civil War is fought in the South, and much of its territory is becoming devastated, and that's having an enormous impact on the economy. The other problem is that the South is subject to the Union naval blockade, which is becoming more and more effective. Both of these factors are strangling their economy and making things far, far harder for Southern families. That's also a problem for troops in the field as well. Less rations, far fewer ways to really celebrate the holiday. And this also impacts on the ability to provide gifts to children. Indeed, as the war goes on, there is more and more of a need to explain to children that Christmas is just not going to be celebrated in the way it was before the war. In some cases, they're not going to get any gifts. So you start to hear Southern families tell their children that Santa is a Yankee or Santa has been killed by the Yankees. One of the more strange explanations comes from an editorial in the Richmond Examiner, where the writer said that there was no real Santa, that in fact he was a Dutch toy mongerer and an immigrant from England who had nothing to do with the real Virginia hospitality and Christmas merrymakings. Now, I don't know about you, I find that very convoluted. I almost wonder if he had too much cough syrup that day. But it drives home the fact that for many in the South, during the Civil War, Christmas really ceased to exist. Now, Lincoln and Nast both play upon the disparity of what's happening at Christmas time in the North and the South. Abraham Lincoln is a lot of things. He's a brilliant statesman, a gifted politician, but he's also a very gifted propagandist. He uses Christmas to the maximum in trying to advance the Union War effort. Just a little background on Lincoln. When he was a state senator in Illinois, well before the Civil War, he had actually voted against making Christmas an official state holiday. But as President of the United States during the Civil War, he does everything he can to promote the Christmas holiday. He holds elaborate receptions at the White House. He and the cabinet go to many Union Army camps and hospitals to celebrate Christmas with the troops and with the wounded. And he's doing this because he understands the powerful message that Christmas and Santa Claus are delivering both to Union morale and to people in the Confederacy. Indeed, he says that Nast's vision of Santa Claus is one of the most valuable recruiting agents for the Union Army. And Lincoln's use of Christmas and the Christmas holiday are reflected in this cartoon or illustration by Nast. And in this illustration, what you see in the background is this enormous feast going on. It represents the Union, and there's this vast banquet table, never-ending feast. And what is Lincoln doing? He's going to the door in the middle of this feast, and he opens it up, and he sees these scraggly-looking Confederate soldiers, and they represent the Confederate States. And what Lincoln is doing in this illustration by Nast is, with Christian charity, offering them the opportunity to come back into the fold and take part in this sumptuous feast. And what Nast does in this cartoon to really drive home the point is, on these little corner panels, he's showing these vignettes from the Civil War and from the Bible of scenes where people who are sinners are coming back seeking forgiveness and are being taken back and given charity. This illustration, I think, is a great example of Nast's vision of what the American Christmas holiday should be about. A beautiful blend of the spiritual and the material. Another theme that Nast pursues during the Civil War and will become part of the American Christmas tradition is tying the celebration of Christmas to honoring the American military. And you see this becomes part of the Civil War. When General Sherman captures the port city of Savannah in December 21st of 1864, again, he invokes Christmas in announcing the victory. He will telegraph Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." And Lincoln responds in kind. He says, Many, many thanks for your Christmas gift, the capture of Savannah. And as I will talk about a little bit further on, this becomes an American tradition, a Christmas tradition. In 1865, the war ends. Nast celebrates it in this cartoon, really driving home some of the themes about Christmas that Nast has been able to establish during the war. First of all, on the top tier, the most important part of the Christmas holiday are the children. And you see them celebrating the holiday with toys. And then below that, you see scenes of families being together. In some cases, they are together for the first time in years. And then at the bottom, you see sort of a national celebration of the holiday. America on a stage, getting together, the American family being reunited. It's very upbeat, it's very emotional. However, Nast being Nast, does introduce one kind of sour note to the festivities, and that is, at the center of the stage, you see Ulysses S. Grant, who is one of Nast's heroes. He sees him as one of the saviors of the United States, and Grant is surrounded by the disembodied heads of Confederate leaders. You know, what can I say? All family reunions have some awkward moments, but for the most part, this is Nast's celebration of Christmas and celebration of a reunited America. In the years that follow, there are efforts to try to use American holidays like Christmas to help reunite the country. And indeed, in June of 1870, now President Grant signs into law a bill establishing a select number of holidays as federal holidays. They include Christmas, they include the 4th of July, New Year's Day, and Thanksgiving. And these are federal holidays meant for all Americans to enjoy. Now, just a note here. Of course, Christmas is primarily a Christian holiday. It's something designed to celebrate the birth of Christ for many Americans. But that's not the purpose in making it a federal holiday. Indeed, Grant and others who supported making Christmas a holiday also opposed an attempt to declare America a Christian nation. Christmas, as it was established as a holiday, is something that's meant for all Americans to enjoy in the way they choose fit to. In terms of, if you're a Christian, of course, you recognize it as a celebration of the birth of Christ, but others can celebrate it in the way they choose. There are contemporary accounts in Philadelphia newspapers, for example, that Christmas is very, very popular among what they term Israelite families. Those are Jews. So Christmas very quickly catches on with people from all walks of life. One of the other aspects to Christmas is that people tend to think that it was made a national holiday because they wanted to reunite, the North and the South. That's true. That's a very strong reason that it did become a national holiday along with these other holidays. But another driving force is that America is having to deal with a whole new wave of immigration. As strange as it may seem, the decade of the Civil War brings in a whole new wave of immigrants, over 5.5 million immigrants. It's hard to wrap your head around the fact that in the middle of the Civil War, America is still being flooded by immigrants. And one of the reasons for these holidays being established is to try to help assimilate these new Americans by having them joyfully celebrate some real American holidays. Now, Nast, in the decades following the Civil War, will continue his efforts to kind of solidify his vision of the American Christmas, and he really focuses in on Santa Claus. He will establish the fact that Santa Claus is married. There is a Mrs. Santa Claus. He will also create the modern vision of Santa Claus. He decides that Santa Claus should be mirrored after the most influential men of the time, leaders of industry like Carnegie or Rockefeller. So he no longer wears a shabby suit. He wears a very nicely tailored red and white suit. He's also a captain of industry in terms of generosity. He now operates on international scale. He has an international headquarters at the North Pole. He has factories or workshops, skilled laborers or elves. And he has an enormous database called the Book of Who's Naughty and Nice. So he's kind of a titan of the generosity industry. Now, some people may tell you that our vision of Santa Claus was created by the Coca-Cola Company in the early 1930s. That's balderdash. If you look at these two illustrations, you can see that the one that Nast did in the 1880s has all the elements of the modern Santa Claus. One thing that I think is important to point out in this illustration is that if you look carefully, you'll see that Santa Claus in the Nast illustration has a sword hanging from his belt, and Santa's also wearing a knapsack. And the reason for that is Nast wanted to continue the association between Christmas, Santa Claus, and the United States military. And that kind of legacy lingers on to this very day. And you see it over the decades since the Civil War. From looking at this slide, from left to right, you see Santa in the First World War, and then Santa in the Second World War. In the photograph, black and white photograph, you see Santa in the Cold War. Here he is in the Berlin airlift. And then to your lower right, you see Santa in more modern deployments of U.S. soldiers. And then, of course, Santa has always been associated with the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve's Toys for Tots campaign. Santa is so part of the United States military story that indeed the U.S. and Canadian North American Aerospace Defense Command dedicates a large part of its efforts during the Christmas holiday to tracking Santa and protecting him during Christmas Eve. So, in looking at the Civil War and its effect on how Christmas is celebrated today, I think there are a number of really significant points to look at. The Civil War really united the observance of the holiday and transformed it into a national holiday. It took many aspects of Christmas that came from different cultures and blended them into a uniquely American form of the holiday, both in terms of the customs and the images. It helped develop a Christmas that really uniquely balances the celebration of the spiritual and the material. It promoted a Christmas with kind of an all-inclusive nature, and it established America as the arbiter of all things Christmas for much of the world. Now, just to add a few more things, the one thing the Civil War didn't do and Nast didn't do is there was one element of Christmas as we celebrate today that wasn't quite established, and the hint is on the screen there. And you probably may have guessed it. Yes, it's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the one reindeer I left out before. Now, Rudolph came to us a little later in our history. He was established in the late 1930s as part of a promotional effort, Christmas time promotional effort, done by the Marshall Field department store chain. And it was a very successful one, ran for a couple of years. It was developed by one of their advertising executives, Robert L. May, and they eventually decided to drop the campaign, but when they did, they gave the copyright for Rudolph to Mr. May. They may have made a mistake in doing that because his brother-in-law was a gentleman by the name of Johnny Marks, who's an extremely successful songwriter, and he wrote a song called Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which was recorded by one of the great recording artists at the time, Gene Autry. It became a mega success. It was recorded by many other artists, still is recorded today, and made both gentlemen a lot of money. Now, what's kind of ironic about this is this major new element of the way we celebrate Christmas today was, created by these two gentlemen, and both of these gentlemen were Jewish. Now, to talk a little bit more about Johnny Marks, who you see in this slide on the right with a deer, not necessarily Rudolph, was one of the great Christmas songwriters of all time. He wrote so many Christmas songs, I can't go through them all. Everything from Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree to Have a Holly Jolly Christmas. But one of his biggest successes was a song called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. He wrote the melody for it, but he did not write the words. It's based on a poem that was done by one of the great poets of the Civil War, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it's a very moving poem about the fact that his son, Charles Longfellow, had been severely wounded in the middle of the war and had returned home, and it was not known whether he would survive or not. Fortunately, he did. So even when you think that a Civil War, or rather a Christmas tradition is not part of the Civil War, it turns out that indeed it does have its roots in the Civil War. So thank you very much for listening to this, and I really want to thank the Adams County Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I'm listing my sources for this presentation. I welcome you to look at them. I think you'll enjoy reading them. Here is my contact information if you have any questions for me, and I wish you all a very Merry Christmas.